I think that if CNN were to come out with a special tomorrow on visitors from other parts of our galaxy, it would be one thing, but I don't, the credibility isn't there necessarily because people have developed a deep distrust of institutions and big thinking.
Dr. Randy Pozos earned his Ph.D. in social cultural anthropology and a master's degree in public health from UC Berkeley. He's an ordained Catholic deacon and one hell of a nice guy.
In fact, there was a great meme I saw in which poor fellow's driving by in his saucer, and he gets an emergency communique saying, "You're too close to Earth, lock your doors." And I think that that's one of the possible explanations, is a lot like the prime directive, no contact, that there are people around potentially who, see us and leave us alone. The other is somehow they feel that any contact with us right now would really be detrimental. Any sort of contact with another species that's really advanced, to us is really going to appear like magic, right? When indigenous people encountered weapons, fire sticks, right? And even the more dangerous weapon of whiskey, that really resulted in the collapse of their cultures, their way of life. And I think for us, encountering someone that can really do interstellar travel, they're going to be so advanced that what it could do to our sense of ourselves could really be devastating. I mean, we do have a lot of thought experiments, right? We have the whole science fiction literature where we have beings who come to visit us who are benevolent. We also have the War of the Worlds. And if someone were just to appear tomorrow, would it be like the movie Independence Day? Or would it be something more benign? And even if there's a very old, early Rod Serling episode in which a visitor comes and the visitor offers the cure for cancer. However, he's shot before he can even offer it. He throws a container, his dying breath, and a torch falls on it. They manage to save a piece of the paper and realize that it's a cure for cancer. So, what would it do to us? We are very apprehensive about other people. We break ourselves up into groups and we define others as other and somehow not human, and we go after them. So if someone were to approach us at this stage of development, it might be less than positive, even if they had the best of intentions. I mean, it's one of our many thought experiments. Going for more of the worlds, we have these people that show up who are like us. They really want to exploit resources. Many human groups have gone to other parts of the planet just to exploit the natural resources and kill off the natives. That's not a new narrative in our history. In fact, you could argue that Independence Day really is a projection of our dark side. There was a real interest in space in the 50s and 60s. We had, the race to the moon. But interestingly, and then that all faded away. People got interested in other things. NASA got interested in missions that didn't involve humans. And it got very quiet. And now what's very interesting is that we do have SpaceX, and we do have other people looking at commercial approaches to space exploration, particularly the moon and Mars. One of the things that we talked about many years ago, and I think is still viable, is that there's an awful lot of mineral potential in the asteroid belt beyond Mars. And so really, if you had a base on the moon that would get you out of the Earth's gravity well, you could then leapfrog to Mars, have bases there, perhaps even do manufacturing on Mars, but you could bring in materials, even perhaps small asteroids from the asteroid belt. And I think, it sounds very mercenary, but I think that is really going to be the big driver. We'd like to think that peaceful exploration by benevolent nation states, if you can call us that, is the way to go, taxpayer-funded things. But the reality is that We've always been a mercantile country. We were part of an early mercantile experiment with the British Empire. And so I think that just that interest in the economics of it will drive it. Now, there is a broader interest, and interestingly, if you look at the European expansion into the Americas and other parts of the world, in the European expansion, they were motivated by looking for gold and minerals, for slaves, for ivory. But there was another very humanistic component of that in terms of people looking for a place where they could live, a place where perhaps they could find some type of freedom. And I think both of these things will happen now as we, reach out to Mars. It's seen by Elon Musk and other people. I mean, this came up in the 80s when Reagan was saying that a nuclear war was winnable. Even John Brandenburg brought this up early on, that we had to have another place in case we blew ourselves up here. And of course, even John has perhaps noticed evidence of nuclear warfare as he feels he's seen it on Mars. But the point is that there's going to be a large humanistic movement perhaps to explore, to find a second home for us. And that seems to be what Musk is about. But there are a lot of other commercial interests in mining and off-planet manufacturing. Well, we really haven't talked about archaeology on Mars. It's not really come up. Obviously, the imaging, what we've learned through the rovers and other exploration is intriguing. And, we would say that's a geological interest, although I would argue that the planetary name for Mars is Ares, so it's probably aerosology. But the point of all that is that to have archaeology, you have to have some evidence of ruins or some evidence of previous habitation. And right now we know that archaeologists do a lot of work in areas where there are just remnants of campfires or remnants of settlements. But no, there's been no real archaeological interest. And unless you can get there and see it yourself and turn over stones, I don't really see how you could do archaeology. Clearly, there are great technical advances in archaeology with digital imaging and rovers, drone types of tools and imaging that could be used, but I haven't seen any sign of it. I think the question about academia is an interesting one. Credibility is everything in academia, and you don't want to be dismissed as a nutcase. So ostensibly in academia, you would have hard data like Mark Carlotto's data. But even when he took it to his alma mater, to Carnegie Mellon, he really got laughed out of the room by students because the premise was so ridiculous. So if you're going to be a serious academic and want to advance your career, you're really not going to go out on such a limb. I mean, it really would make no sense. However, and I think this is what often happens, is that certainly anthropology, social cultural anthropology, which is my field, was really developed as a tool of European empires to somehow understand the natives in terms of controlling them. It was a tool of colonial administration. Obviously, it grew beyond that. But I think that to a degree, a lot of our understanding, academic understanding of Mars, is going to happen when there is funding from commercial interests or the government into looking into these items. And I don't mean this unkindly, but you have to find some way of funding your research, and you really can't research a topic if there isn't ready funding. Well, I think probably in the process of colonization, we're going to find out what happened, or at least get some glimpses. I think that a lot of it may be difficult for us to comprehend or even research. I think clearly we'll get a better understanding of all the natural processes on the planet and its magnetic fields, if there were any, its completely complicated planetary history. So I think in the broader sense, we're going to find out about its history the way we found out about history expanding into other areas of the planet. We'll get there, we'll set up shop and say, oh, that's an interesting set of rocks. Or, that's really strange. And I think we'll go from there. I think about the archaeological area, I just think there's no one in archaeology, to my knowledge, who is really interested in this or pursuing it. Perhaps they're pursuing the images. But I think there's different competing interests in terms of Mars. I think the big issue is, since most of it now is taxpayer funded, the NASA and other agencies don't really want to look like they're chasing after something and get shot down in congressional hearings, that this is just a useless waste of taxpayer money. It's been hard enough to keep the space program adequately funded, and so this is quite a risk. Why do something like this and potentially bring down the whole enterprise? So, and I guess there's sort of a pun in there, because it certainly would bring down an entire spaceship. So I can certainly understand that. I think early on, the move to say that this was an artifact of light and shadow was really to avoid sort of distracting people from the NASA agenda, which is very engineering-like and very systematic. Let's get there, let's get something on the ground, let's begin to look at the ground, and let's start at a very low level. Let's keep the funding on this down so that we don't draw too much flack. So I think that's really what's behind it. It's really the politics of the funding. String theory, and other esoteric theories of physics do tend to come and go. String theory is trying to essentially, find the holy grail of physics, which is the grand unified theory. And obviously there's a lot of controversy about it. And I think the issue is that it doesn't take a lot of money to research string theory, because it's primarily theoretical. And it involves thought experiments, and it involves computers doing very sophisticated types of math. And certainly you do have cyclotrons, you do have essentially large, colliders doing it, and obviously those are expensive. But none of them are as expensive as a weekend jaunt to Cydonia to check out the face. We know that people have biases of all kinds, and they're largely unconscious. And this is one of our huge problems in intergroup ethnic relations and race relations within our own species. So obviously you can look at what is a face and be frightened, because it might stir your primal fears about some sort of being or some sort of superior civilization that can cause harm. On the other hand, it might be some type of ancient message. So I think an awful lot of it just involves, human projection and bringing up things for us that we might not even be conscious of. Obviously some people look at something like that and their disposition is to be intrigued because they're curious. They have an investigative mindset, right? But those are usually the kids that we have to watch out for and kind of pull them back by the collar from things that we think are dangerous. And then there's really the vast majority of us in our tribes, really, from our days of being primates. We huddle together. We tend to shy away from danger. We'll have scouts on the edge of our troops. But no, we don't really, we're curious to a degree. We'll send out some people, but it's never really been our mindset. I think the broader issue is a culture is all about a shared system of meaning and value. It's a way of constructing reality, right? So, very simple example is there's a red sign with some letters on it at the end of the street, and it's six-sided. Well, okay, on one level we know it's stop. On another level it means go no further. If we had, and so it's a construction of reality to a degree. The other is, for example, if I come into your personal space and I extend a hand, that is usually interpreted perhaps as a friendly gesture. It's accompanied by certain facial movements. On the other hand, if I come close to you and I don't get the right sense of facial movement, then I'm going to shy away. And I guess the point of all this is not to be too abstract about culture, but we do have ways of looking and seeing things. And for example, when someone from a North Atlantic background looks at someone in West Africa or the Caribbean doing an interesting dance and some music and using some items, right, in a ritual way, that can be frightening, that can be really intriguing. It's called technically a paradigm shift, but all that means is what we thought was right is all of a sudden turned on its head. We used to think that the sun rose in the east and set in the west, and that we were the center of the planets and the sun revolved around us. And yet when we got evidence to the contrary, it was not easily accepted. It was widely rejected. And even today we say the sun rises in the east using an old paradigm. So if we were to encounter ruins and we would see evidence of a lost civilization, or perhaps it was only a summer camp for a group of people traveling by, sitting down on the planet briefly and then going on to visit their grandparents, it would set us on ear because we're all alone. And I think, as humans, we write our own history. We are always at the top of evolution. We're always not only the alpha predator, an apex predator, but we are also, and the way we write our own history, we are the great evolutionary result of a fantastic process. Well, I think it's a lot like you're the bright kid in high school and you go to an Ivy League college and all of a sudden you're surrounded by people that are much smarter than you are. So that would be one benevolent way that would happen. In fact, you find social groups, even the Catholic Church has had study groups and has issued documents saying that people should start thinking about other life forms because of the high probability of their prevalence and what that would mean. So people are thinking about it. Perhaps we're inoculating ourselves so that when it does happen, it's not so devastating. Obviously, I've talked about science fiction as an obvious one, but in our music and in our art, the famous song, Mars is no place to raise a family, right? It's no place to raise children. We're constantly, I think, in our art forms, outside of science fiction, we're looking at what the future may be. We're looking at the fact that, that we are the smallest, perhaps, speck in a galaxy. And our galaxy is perhaps a very small speck in the whole system of galaxies. And that perhaps there's not a lot we're seeing because we don't really perceive dark matter. All of those things, all of those questions push us so that when we get this new information, we begin to have a framework where we can put it. So of course there are other life forms because we are just a little speck. Of course, these other people can come to us because of interstellar travel. And of course, even now we're thinking about the fact, well, we're all moving apart from each other. The redshift is dramatic. And so perhaps it's going to be harder for people, I would say people, but for other life forms to contact us because we're moving apart. And yet the fact that that we conceive the possibility that they can go beyond what our physics tell us is the limit of the speed of light, then we're preparing. In the later part of the 20th century, we had 3 outlets in the United States. We had 3 networks, and we had an emerging public broadcasting system. Now, everyone has their own echo chamber. Everyone has their podcasts, their particular websites, particular programs they stream. Even the cable networks are beginning to wonder what their future is. The question is, will there be enough of a movement among podcasts, among some of the significant outlets? Because I don't think we'll ever go back to having controlled central outlets again. I think the only thing that totalitarian governments can do, and we've seen this in China, certainly in North Korea without an internet, but in warfare now, what we're seeing is the internet is turned off. So I think that if CNN were to come out with a special tomorrow on visitors from other parts of our galaxy, it would be one thing, but I don't, the credibility isn't there necessarily because people have developed a deep distrust of institutions and big thinking. So I think that really the emergence of, again, more of our interest in, and I think more of our curiosity about visitors is really going to come more in the streaming realm and also, I think, especially in podcasts. The saving grace of our species is, and also I think our weak point is that we're curious. And so I think if there are ruins, I think the curiosity, the interest level would go up significantly. And now that we have all kinds of distributed research, open source groups, even in planetary science, the weather, all kinds of things, that more than likely a global group would form in a network and begin to do this type of open source research. Our history is soulless that when we're confronted with someone who challenges us or appears to threaten us, we respond in ways that are not that positive. I'd like to think, right? I'd like to think that when it happens, we'll say, oh, sure, we have the numbers here. We knew, why haven't you guys shown up before? I think the question will be, do they come in peace, right? The classic science fiction question. Or do they come like us to exploit natural resources? And that'll be the broader issue. I don't see our ego collapsing that quickly. I think even if they were hostile, you'd see a reaction like Independence Day. Because that's what our species has always done. We find if there's an overwhelming hostile force, then we find ways to combat it, even if it's very passive, even if it's underground. The great heroes, right, are resistance fighters. And so I think obviously people come in peace and we have some way of communicating with each other productively. I think it probably might just enhance us because we'll be able to essentially communicate in a peaceful level with people from a vastly different world. After the great tragedy of 9/11 and the attack on the United States, France said, today we are all Americans, right? And I think there was a great outpouring among our allies. But we are all siblings, right? And so, yes, there's an outside force that unites us, but there's still those competitive forces within us. It's nice to think that we will be united, but if that were the case, then the peace would break out. And I don't mean to be cynical, but a big part of our behavior as Homo sapiens is all about essentially the survival of our band, of our troop. And it's essentially, even though we have cousins across the river, across the creek, they're the dumb ones, right? So I don't think that will ever disappear. And I think that, if obviously, again, going back to Independence Day, if you had a vast hostile invasion, sure, people would unite to a degree. But would we start quibbling over who's going to lead the task force? Would we start quibbling about, even in World War II, we wrestled with the British as to who was going to be in control of the operation. So, yeah, to a degree it would unite us, but it would never really overcome the divisions that are just part of our structure as a primate species. The early Mars researchers in our group said, oh, there was a time when it was really wet and Earth-like, and that was poo-pooed, and that was back in the 80s and 90s, and now it's become a scientific consensus that Mars had an Earth-like phase. So the more we can learn about the planet, the more we'll have a better understanding of how another terrestrial planet functions. If we get there and we find the remains or the ruins or the indications of something done by an intelligent life form, then having the whole background of the planet's history will be able to contextualize what we're finding. So to a degree that's standard archaeology, you know, in order to understand the context of your find, you have to understand the history, the sedimentation, how the fossil got preserved or not. And so that's critical. I mean, on all levels, whether you feel that intelligent life did anything on Mars, to evaluate it, you really have to know the overall context. And I think in that regard, I maybe go back to Carl Sagan, you know, in Cosmos, who pointed out, oh, there are these, you know, pyramids, right? And, you know, the impression being that there was sort of an unusual, you know, process on the planet that produced them. And so they were already there. He didn't really dismiss them. And what is key is that knowledge, so we go and we find these pyramidal shapes, and perhaps they are just the products of a natural process on Mars. But we won't really know that unless we know the history of Mars well. And if there is evidence of a lost civilization, and it's anything like ours, it will take advantage of natural landforms to live and to grow. Potentially, we might find more remains of an intelligent civilization on Mars below the surface. It's important to look at the fact that Brandenburg has a background in weapons research and early uses of lasers. And so it's not just someone who is coming out of nowhere speculating about weapons. It's something he understands. And a lot of his work is classified, so there are many things John is not telling us. But if you, and I think even in my book, there was a concluding essay about Mars as a cautionary tale. And John has certainly done that in his writing. That, again, the famous thing, if we don't get our act together here, we'll end up like Mars. Obviously, if we did have a thermonuclear war, there's been a lot of research and speculation about what would happen, nuclear winter, and what would happen to the species, but also to the planet. We're now also facing the other threats of global warming. So if the planetary surface temperature rises, we're looking at a lot of upset and upheaval, perhaps nothing like a nuclear war, but huge displacements, a tremendous amount of the species dying off. So looking at, you know, Brandenburg's work is important because he talks about isotopes, he talks about specific types of measurements, and I can only hope that John is wrong. But his evidence is compelling. And I think, you know, those of us of a certain age remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, and certainly Reagan's notion of a winnable nuclear war. But with the fall of the Soviet Union and the dismantling of a lot of nuclear weapons, we, I think, have become more comfortable with the fact that it's not likely. We never thought that there would be a war in Eurasia again, as there was, as the wars that waged in the 16th through the 20th century, but we have one. And we have Ukraine, which was a nuclear power, gave up its nuclear weapons in exchange for guarantees of protection from the United States and from Russia. So, and now Russia is even talking about perhaps tactical nuclear weapons. We're reluctant, the United States is reluctant to have Ukraine go into Russia. So, yeah, I think if nothing else from Brandenburg's work, we need to realize that nuclear weapons and even a limited nuclear war with tactical nukes would be our undoing.
This is the continuing series of Blue Planet Red, an award-winning documentary film on the history, evidence for life, and catastrophes that contributed to the death of Mars. The documentary includes interviews with NASA's lead astrobiologist, university professors, aerospace industry scientists, and independent researchers. If Mars was like Earth in the distant past, could there still be life there now? What happened to it? And what turned a blue planet red?